Hi, and welcome to the Class 2 video. In this video, we will be introducing you to the most traditional way to study critical thinking, which is by looking at arguments. An argument, as I said in video 1, is basically just the practice of giving reasons for your belief. In this video, we're going to be talking about the most basic components that make up an argument: statements, premises, conclusions, and inferences. This video assumes that you've read sections 1.1 to 1.3 of the chapter of the textbook that I posted, and that you've done the exercises that were included on the separate exercise sheet. So argument is the central idea in the traditional philosophical approach to critical thinking, but in many ways it remains the foundation of critical thinking even as we move through the other methods and disciplines. This is because this is the one part of critical thinking that focuses exclusively on how we find the truth. Remember in the last class, we said that we were working with a broadly epistemological approach to critical thinking. Epistemic conceptions of critical thinking are those that focus on the kinds of thinking that lead to knowledge. And epistemology in general is just the study of knowledge, what it is and how we get it. In the traditional approach to critical thinking, we stay as close as we can to this original mission by focusing on arguments and giving evidence. But even as we move into looking at cognitive bias and social epistemology, the ideas of argument and inference will continue to remain central. So as I said before, we're looking at in this course we're covering three approaches to critical thinking. The traditional philosophy is what we're doing now, looks at arguments, and the name for a common problem you'll see pretty soon is a fallacy, which is just a bad argument that appears to be a good argument. In psychology, they focus more on unconscious mental processes, and there the name for the common problem is a cognitive bias. And the third approach we're going to be looking at is called social epistemology. And it looks at things like networks and relationships and information flow, trust, testimony. This is still a new field, but I'm going to say that the thing that is most central that people worry about for this new field that's a problem is testimonial injustice. So in this first module, I'm giving you previews of these three approaches. And then we have one module each on those approaches. But even in these later sections, the idea of argument will remain central. The cognitive biases we will study in section 3 are things that distort evidence, right? So the idea of evidence is still there. And a lot of the processes that we think of as simply revealing basic facts to us, things like perception and memory, actually work a lot more like inferences. When we get to social epistemology, we're going to be broadening our scope from social processes to bring us to the truth, to also processes that create ignorance. And we're also going to have to look at the general idea of how identity groups function, because identity groups are key for the flow of information. But even here, arguments and inferences are central because they're the thing that brings us to the truth. So all this to say, the ideas we're going to be introducing in this class session, in this video, are things we're going to be returning to constantly. And they play a big role in all the tests, including the first one. Okay, so pay attention and let's talk about the traditional approach. Although the modern critical thinking movement started with Dewey, it's important to emphasize that people all over the world and throughout history have written manuals for argumentation. And the emphasis in all of this literature is on arguments that are given in language rather than unconscious processing of information, which is what modern psychology talks about. So here are three very old examples of argument manuals for how to argue, and they perfectly fit the critical thinking tradition as it exists in its modern form. So in ancient Greece, a philosopher named Aristotle wrote a book called The Sophistical Refutations. It's about 350 BCE. In ancient India, the Nyaya Sutra was composed sometime between 600 BCE and 200 CE. It's always much harder to date ancient Indian philosophy than ancient Greek philosophy. And Moja in Warring States, China, somewhere between 500 and 300 BCE. All these people were producing handbooks for argumentation that fit the tradition that we're doing here. Okay, so this is fundamentally about arguments given in language. So we need to start by understanding a basic element of language. And that element is the statement. Your reading had a definition of a statement that we're using in this class. So you might want to pause the video and be sure you've found it and you've got it in your notes, because this is going to be important. So what you should find is something like this. A statement is a unit of language that can be true or false. And that might be a little hard to understand, but it can help to think about contrasts. So this is a statement. The man was found wandering disoriented in a field. That's a statement. It could be true, it could be false. It's just describing a situation. Now, if I take away words from this, it is no longer a statement. It's just a sentence fragment. So if I say, wandering disoriented in a field on its own, that's a sentence fragment. So that's not a complete statement. It's no longer the kind of thing that can be true or false. Statements can also be contrasted with questions. Why was that man wandering disoriented in a field, right? Statements can also be contrasted with commands, like, stop wandering and do something with your life. And the final thing that statements can be contrasted with are exclamations, right? Like, oh, that poor man. The important thing to see about each of these kinds of things that aren't statements is that they are no longer parts of language that can be true or false, right? An exclamation isn't true or false. It's just an expression of emotion. A command isn't true or false. It's just obeyed or not obeyed. And a question doesn't make a statement. It asks for a statement. Sentence fragments are too short to evaluate for whether or not they're true or false. So your first exercise was just to look at a bunch of passages and identify which of them are statements. And some of these are pretty straightforward, but some of them might be a little bit more tricky. So let's just run through these answers. The first passage was, England is smaller than China. Yeah, that's a statement, right? It's a true statement. So there you go. On the other hand, look at the next one. Greenland is south of Jerusalem. Well, that's a false statement, but it's still a statement, right? So the first two comments are statements, even though one is true and one is false. Is New Jersey east of Wisconsin? That is not a statement. That is a question, right? The atomic number of helium is 2. That is a statement. Now look at the next one. The atomic number of helium is pi. This is also a statement. It's kind of a silly statement. If you remember your high school chemistry class, atomic numbers can only be whole numbers. And so an atomic number just can't be pi. But still, this is a statement. It's of the right form that we can evaluate whether it's true or false. And in this case, we just say it's false. The next three things go together. I hate overcooked noodles. Blah. Overcooked noodles. Overcooked noodles are disgusting. Actually, the first and last one of these are statements, and the middle one is not. It's an exclamation. Now, it's funny because all three of these kind of do roughly the same thing. Like, you might utter any one of these in the same a context, and it would have the same effect on people. But only the first one and the last one have the form of a statement. Blah, overcooked noodles has the form of an exclamation, right? Yeah. So the other thing you might think here is that some of these might be labeled opinions, right? So if I said overcooked noodles are disgusting, you might say, that's just your opinion. But as the video by John Corvino emphasized, and you should have watched that earlier, or you will be watching it later after this, the fact-opinion distinction isn't actually important for what we are doing in a critical thinking class. Both facts and opinions amount to statements, and statements can either be supported by evidence or not. So let's keep going. Take your time. That's not a statement, that's a command. So rather than being true or false, you just either do it or you don't. This is the last question. That is a statement. It's not a question. So here's something I think is really interesting. ChatGPT appears to recognize statements. At the very least, if you give it this homework assignment as input, it gives you the correct output. And this is true even though ChatGPT doesn't really understand the truth. I mean, you can tell just from the amount of falsehoods in its output and the irregularity of it. This is not a machine that can identify truth. Nevertheless, it can identify statements. Let's take a look at this. Okay, so I fed this homework assignment to ChatGPT, and this is what it gave me. First of all, it began by giving me a definition of a statement, which I didn't ask for, but this is something that ChatGPT does all the time. No matter what, it likes to tell you definitions of things. I think this might be because they're programming it to answer Google, search questions. So this kind of definition doing is important. In any case, it gives basically the correct answer. It says a statement is a declarative sentence that can be either true or false, but not both. I don't include that but not both clause because that actually gets into weird philosophical territory. But now it's taking a look at the problems. So England is smaller than China. Yes, this is a statement. It makes a factual claim. See, it gave an answer, and it kind of correctly explained it. Is New Jersey east of Wisconsin? It is a question, as indicated by the presence of the question mark. So it's getting these right. Only with number 5 does it bother to point out that the statement is false. I don't know why it did that. The trio of comments about overcooked noodles, it gets right. So it recognizes 6 as a statement and 8 as a statement. And it calls both 6 and 8 personal opinions, but that's fine. It recognizes that opinions are statements, and it recognizes that 7 is an exclamation. So it can do this. Of course, I don't want you to to have this machine do your homework for you, because you need to be able to think for yourself. I'm. This might be alarmist of me, but I'm kind of worried that we're going to start letting the machines think for us, and they're not actually going to think the way we want to be thinking. That's pretty broad. It's kind of gloomy, and also maybe I'm overreacting. But please don't have ChatGPT do your homework, because you need to think for yourself. You can't let a machine think for you. So I'm going to emphasize again that statements are the main category of thing that we're going to be talking about are statements. And the statements will include both what sometimes gets called fact and sometimes gets called opinion. So on the page for this class, there's a link to a video by John Corvino that goes into more detail about this. And I encourage you to check that out. Okay, so statements get put together to make arguments. An argument is the fundamental thing that we're really talking about when we take this approach to critical thinking, the classical approach. An argument is a connected series of statements designed to convince an audience of another statement, right? So you can do lots of things with statements, but one of the things you can do is string them together so that some of them provide evidence for others. The statement you are trying to prove is the conclusion. The statement that shows that act as evidence are called the premises. So let me give you an example. Monica is playing a game of Clue. The bit in the italics here sets our context. Remember, Clue is an old board game where you play a detective, right? So this is an example of an argument. It's an example, actually, of argument by process of elimination. And if you played Clue before, you know that actually the whole thing, all the reasoning in that game is actually a process of elimination. It's a basic, fundamental form of human reasoning. So Monica reasons the possible murder weapons are the knife, the candlestick, the revolver, the rope, the lead pipe, and the wrench. The murder weapon was not the knife. The murder weapon also was not the revolver, the rope, the lead pipe, or the wrench. Therefore, the murder weapon was the candlestick. So this is a kind of reasoning that we call argument. And actually, Monica could be thinking this to herself. This could be a matter of internal reasoning, or she could be speaking aloud to another player. Maybe they're working together as a team. So the most basic thing you're going to be doing in the upcoming exercises is identifying arguments and identifying their premises and their conclusions. So just a quick note about format. When I present passages, they're going to look like that Clue passage. They're going to have a bit of italics at the beginning that give you some context. And the reason for this is that meaning always changes with regard to context. So this is a diagram from the textbook. It shows one statement. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. And then it presents it in two different contexts. The contexts are given in italics. So for the first one, Susan is arguing with a young Earth creationist, and she makes this assertion. That's going to have one kind of meaning. In particular, she's going to be using this as evidence for other things or that sort of thing. On the other hand, if you put that same statement in a college-level geology textbook, it's no longer going to be part of an argument. It's going to be something that you just take on authority. So for the exercises that are coming up, the thing to remember is that the argument is in regular typeface, if there's an argument, and the italics give you the context. So how do you tell an argument? Well, what you want to do is you want to look and see if some statements support others. The fundamental idea of an argument is that things are being used as evidence for other things. So that's what you want to look for. Sometimes, though, there are hints. We call these premise and conclusion indicators. Sometimes indicator words, or sometimes they're longer phrases. But these are things we do in language to tell our audience that we are about to give an argument, either a premise or a conclusion. But we don't always use them when we're giving arguments. Sometimes we forget to flag things with argument indicators. Other times, and this is more insidious, people will use premise and conclusion indicators when there actually isn't an argument there. They're trying to fool you. So the main thing you really want to look for is whether or not some statements support others, and then use the indicator words as a hint for that. All right, so what's an indicator word? Well, the most standard premise indicator word is because. When people say because, that's a way of announcing that what comes next is the premise of an argument. And there are other words that are similar that are basically synonyms. So you might say as, or for, or since, given that, for the reason that. These are all synonyms for because, and as such, they are premise indicators. The standard conclusion indicator word is therefore. So basically, your two most standard words in English for dealing with arguments are because and therefore. But there are a slew of other indicators in English that can be used that are basically synonyms for therefore. Thus, hence, so, consequently, it follows that, in conclusion, as a result, etc., 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 right? So you want to look, when you're identifying arguments, for premise and conclusion indicator words. And this tells you both that there is an argument there and that which part of the argument is the premise and which is the conclusion. Let's go back and look at the clue example. It's got this conclusion indicator word in it, therefore, right? So if you were presented this passage as a problem, you could zoom in on the word therefore and realize that that means that you're looking at an argument and the last statement in the passage is the conclusion of the argument. So when you are doing your exercises, one of the main things you have to do is put arguments in what we call standard form. And all that means is that you list the premises on separate lines, P1, P2, P3 for your premises. In this little schema here, there are 3, but you can have any number of premises. And then you draw a line, and then you write the conclusion. And it's meant to look somewhat like addition, right? And that's because mathematics is a rational process like argument. And so we use the same sort of forms to represent things. So this is the argument from clue presented in what we call standard form, right? So premise 1 rules out a whole bunch of murder weapons. Premise 2 premise 1 lists the possible murder weapons, right? Lists all the possibilities. Premise 2 rules out the knife. Premise 3 rules out a bunch of other things, and that leads you to the conclusion that the murder weapon was the candlestick. And we write the indicator words separately. We say therefore. So when you put things in standard form, there are some bits of advice. First of all, it's fine to paraphrase to make things shorter. In fact, sometimes that's going to be absolutely necessary. But you must continue to use complete sentences because arguments are composed of statements, and I want to keep people in the habit of thinking and writing in terms of complete statements, right? You have to keep the basic meaning intact. If you encounter questions or commands, they may actually be functioning as statements, and so you just have to transform them. People use rhetorical questions, and you just transform them into a statement. You want to delete irrelevant or redundant material. Sometimes, in particular, people will repeat their conclusion. Sometimes they'll repeat it at the beginning and the ending of the passage. When you put the argument in standard form, you only need to write it once at the end, right? So you delete redundant material, you delete irrelevant material, and remember that your conclusion in an ordinary English passage could be anywhere in the passage. It could be at the beginning, the middle, or the end, and it could be repeated. And then finally, remove indicator words and write them separately. Some more vocab around arguments and statements. The connection between the premise and the conclusion is called the inference, right? So we say if you make an inference, if you draw a conclusion based on certain premises. Statements can be either normative or descriptive. And this gets back to the thing I was talking about where we talk about how fact and opinion doesn't really matter here. What does matter is that some statements are about the way the world is, and some statements are about the way the world should be. So a statement that's about the way the world is called a descriptive statement. So the cat is on the mat. Objects near the Earth's surface fall at an accelerating rate of 9.8 meters per second. Those describe the way the world is. Normative statements describe the way the world should be, or at least the way you think they should be. So if you say you shouldn't chew with your mouth open, or torturing babies for fun is wrong, you are using normative statements. And all of ethics is really based around, ethics and morality is based around normative statements. It's not about the way the world is, but about the way you think the world should be. So it's important to talk about normative and descriptive statements because we're going to often want to argue not about the way the world is, but about what we want to change in the world. So it's important also to note how normative and descriptive statements work in arguments. An argument can contain both normative and descriptive statements. However, if it has a normative conclusion, it must have at least one normative premise. This is called the is-ought fallacy if you do it wrong. You can't derive an ought from an is. The is only tells you how the world is. It doesn't tell you how the world should be. Okay, so here's an example. O.J. Simpson intentionally killed Nicole Brown. It is premise 2, it is wrong to intentionally kill people. The first premise is descriptive. The second premise is normative. The second premise is what allows you to move to the conclusion that what O.J. did was wrong. Okay, the next set of homework problems asked you to look at passages with arguments in them and to rewrite those passages in standard form, writing out the conclusions and premises separately and also listing the indicator words. So let's take a look at those problems. Okay, so for the first exercise set, you just had to put arguments in standard form. And that means recognizing the premise and the conclusion and separating out any indicator words. So the very first problem is really straightforward. So remember, the stuff in italics is context. We're just imagining that there's a detective speaking. So the first thing you want to do when you look at a passage like this is to look for indicator words or indicator phrases. And we can see that, in fact, there is one. So I infer that. That is a conclusion indicator. So that means that everything that comes after it is the conclusion. Henry stole the computer. Right? So whenever you're dealing with arguments like this, you really want to work backwards from the conclusion. Once you know what the conclusion is, you can easily figure out the rest of it. So what we're going to do here is we're going to draw a line. We're going to say conclusion. Henry stole the computer. And then our premise is just Henry's fingerprints were on the computer. We can paraphrase. And then we just write our indicator word separately. Indicator. So I infer that. So the first problem was really straightforward. There was just one premise and one conclusion, and the conclusion came second, just like it does in standard form. Now let's try the next one. So the context is that someone named Monica is wondering about her coworker's political opinions. So she works with this guy, Steve. She wonders how he thinks about things. And she says, you cannot both oppose abortion and support the death penalty unless you think there's a difference between fetuses and felons. Steve opposes abortion and supports the death penalty. Therefore, Steve thinks there's a difference between fetuses and felons. Well, the obvious important word here is therefore, right? Therefore is our conclusion indicator, and that means everything that after that is the conclusion. And in general, in analyzing arguments, it's best to work backwards from the conclusion. So we're just going to write conclusion, Steve thinks there is a difference between fetuses and felons. And the indicator is because. Oh, I'm sorry, therefore. So we've got two premises. They're both kind of wordy, and it's hard to figure out how to cut them, make them shorter. So we'll just write them all out. P1, you cannot oppose abortion and support the death penalty unless you think there's a difference between felons, fetuses and felons. P2, Steve opposes abortion and supports the death penalty. All right. Okay, the first two problems had the conclusion at the end of the English passage, which is also where it goes in standard form. But in ordinary English, the conclusion can be anywhere, the beginning, the end, the middle, sometimes both the beginning and the end. So here's another passage where the conclusion is in a different place. Here we've got the indicator word because. And that says that everything after it is a premise, not a conclusion. So this is a made-up sci-fi-ish example. You imagine someone called the Grand Moff of Earth Defense Strategy, and he notes that when people from one planet invade another, they're killed by local diseases because, and then there are two examples that are silly and made up. So we know that these two examples are the premises, and the first sentence actually is the conclusion. So we can go down here, conclusion, when people from one planet invade another, they are killed by local diseases. All right. Indicator is because. Then we've got two examples for premises, P1, P2. When Hitler invaded the moon, when Mars invaded Earth is P1. They were killed by Earth diseases. And P2, when Hitler invaded the moon. His forces were killed by moon diseases. All right, and one thing that we'll be thinking about later on is the different ways in which this argument is faulty, but we won't be doing that right now. Okay, now things are getting harder. This one has no context. It's just sort of made up. It's about the Jabberwock, a made-up creature from Lewis Carroll. As the speaker is saying, if you have slain the Jabberwock, my son, it will be a frabjous day. The Jabberwock lies there dead, its head cleft with your vorpal sword. This is truly a frabjous day. The other thing that's tricky here is that there are no indicator words. You just have to figure out what is which of these premises support which. And the thing to see here is that you've got an if-then clause, and then another thing says that the if part has been satisfied, therefore the then part is true. So our conclusion is this is a frabjous day. And, what does frabjous mean? You just have to get used to putting made-up things in a black box and not worrying about it. That's part of content neutrality. No indicators. P1, if you have slain the Jabberwock, it is a frabjous day. You have slain the Jabberwock. Oh, it's CK. All right, and my handwriting is poor, but you get the idea. All right, the last one is the trickiest of all because it's actually conclusion middle, which is an awkward way to write, but it happens in the real world, and you need to be on the lookout for it. You can see that there are two indicators here, therefore and because. So indicators. Therefore, because. And your conclusion is the thing between them. She must be the killer, where the she is Miss Scarlet. So, then the premises is Miss Scarlet was jealous. And Miss Scarlet was the only one with a motive. All right, so this time the conclusion is in the middle. Okay, so the last set of problems asks you to distinguish arguments from non-arguments. And then if they are arguments, you have to write them in standard form. So this is similar to what we were doing with statements, where we had to distinguish statements from non-statements. And then I gave examples of kinds of things that weren't statements, like questions and commands, to help you get a sense of the contrast. So here I just want to give you a sense of the kinds of things that aren't arguments. So again, you can develop a contrast. One thing that isn't an argument is simply a statement of belief. A lot of times people will just list things they believe. And this can actually be rhetorically extremely powerful. In the textbook, I gave an example from Dr. Martin Luther King's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he just has a bunch of sentences that begin, I believe. I believe that even amid today's mortar bursts and whirring bullets, there is still hope for a brighter tomorrow. And then a couple more things like that. This is very powerful speaking. It's very powerful rhetoric. When the speaker says what they believe, you want to believe with them because of the power of their belief. That's not argument, though. That is rhetoric. It's good rhetoric. It's appealing to your emotions. We are 90% emotional animals, so it's going to be most of our lives most of the time. But simply listing what you believe is not an argument. Another thing you can do is organize statements around a topic, but they're not designed to be like one thing supporting another. They're just kind of a well-organized list, right? So I gave an example from a college psychology textbook where they list 3 different ways to deal with phobias, right? And all of that is just, there's no argument there. Those are just 3 different things connected by the fact that they belong to this general category, ways to deal with phobias. A third thing that's not an argument is a narrative. Narratives are statements that describe events happening over time, a sequence of actions. And again, it's not an argument because you don't have one thing supporting another. There's one more category of things that isn't an argument that we won't be dealing with in this section. We're going to deal with it in the next class. This is called an explanation. It's on this slide, but you don't have to worry about it now because nothing in the homework problem set were explanations. Okay, and for this problem set, I'm just going to do the first 2, and then there will be an answer sheet that will be uploaded where you can get the answers to the remaining problems. Okay, so for this next problem set, you had to identify whether something was an argument or a non-argument. If it was a non-argument, you had to explain why it was a non-argument by saying what kind of non-argument you thought it was. And if it was an argument, you had to write it out in standard form. So for this first problem, again, remember the stuff in italics is the context. And you can see the context here is just an old newspaper article. And in this case, the context is kind of telling. because you want to think about what kinds of things you generally see in newspapers, particularly when it's just like maybe the front page of the business section here. In any case, the passage reads, the unemployment rate dropped to 8.3%, the lowest since February 2009. Labor Department figures showed today in Washington. The 243,000 increase in jobs was the biggest in 9 months and exceeded the most optimistic forecast in a Bloomberg News survey. Service industries grew by the most in a year, according to a separate report. So what you can see here is that these are just sort of isolated facts. They're grouped around a theme, right? They're all about the unemployment rate, but none of these facts provides evidence for any other fact. And furthermore, the way newspapers are supposed to work, there aren't persuasive arguments in straight reporting. Now, in classes where I go into detail about the way newspapers actually work, we'll show that's not always the case. But still, here this is clearly not an argument. And we don't have to be too precise about what kinds of non-arguments we're dealing with. We could just say it's just reporting. You could also say that it's a collection of facts organized around a theme, something like that. All right, next up, a caller on a radio call-in show has a theory. Context, this guy's explaining their theory. The economy has been in a lot of trouble recently, and it's certainly true that cell phone use has been rising during the same period, so I suspect increasing cell phone use is bad for the economy. So this is a bad argument, but it should be clear that it is an argument, and the conclusion is what comes last. So increasing cell phone use is bad for the economy. So is a premise indicator word. I suspect is actually a confidence indicator phrase, but we won't go into that right now. And then the first two statements are premises. So we can say P1, the economy has been in trouble, and we don't have to write the whole sentence verbatim. We can paraphrase as long as we keep the meaning. Keep the meaning. So we'll also say to cell phone use is up. Conclusion, cell phones are bad for the economy. Okay, number 3. Imagine some corporate headquarters someplace where they make widgets. They've got, and this looks like it's some kind of mission statement. So they say, we believe that our company must deliver a quality product to our customers. Our customers also expect first-rate customer service. At the same time, we must make a profit. So they're listing things they believe, but none of them support each other. So this is not an argument. Simple statement of belief. Less compelling than the Martin Luther King example of simple statements of belief that I used in the textbook. Okay, so here's one that sometimes throws students off. And part of it is because there aren't any indicator phrases in here. So two people are sitting at breakfast, and one says to the other, you should leave now, it's almost 3 a.m. or 9 a.m. and it takes 3 hours to get there. There are no indicator words here. But if you think about it, what Jill is trying to do here is convince Jack that he should leave. This is what she wants him to do, and these are the two premises. These are the two reasons he should do it. It's almost 9. It takes 3 hours to get there. Maybe it's 6 now. So P1, it's almost 9. P2, it takes 3 hours to get there. You should leave now. Notice that this conclusion is a normative statement. It's about what should be. And often, actually, in ordinary contexts, you have arguments with normative statements in the conclusion because we generally argue in order to get people to do things. So we're saying what should happen. Okay, last problem. The context is a textbook on the brain. And it says axons are distinguished from dendrites by several features, and then it lists 3 features, right? So it's got 3 statements in here, effectively. And they all relate back to the first sentence, but they don't really provide argumentative support for the first sentence. This is really a topic statement. And, this is just a collection of facts. So this is not an argument. It's an expository passage. Not an argument. As a topic statement rather than a conclusion, they're just facts organized around a theme. Okay, so here's a question. Can ChatGPT do this homework? And I should say that I'm not pursuing this in any kind of scientific fashion or systematic fashion. I'm just periodically trying the homework on ChatGPT, mostly out of my own curiosity. And, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised that it gets a lot of these problems right. Critical thinking textbooks were a part of its training set. So it's sort of like the way that it does well on the law school exams. Law school exams were also part of its training set. Okay, so one thing I did is I tried giving it the same passage, but moving the conclusion around to different parts of the passage to see if it could recognize that the conclusion had moved. So the first thing I did was I gave it this problem. I think it might actually be in the question bank for the first test. So Cindy is predicting her spring break will go well. She thinks to herself, if the car breaks down on the way to Florida, that would ruin our vacation. But the car isn't going to break down, therefore our vacation will not be ruined. And I ask it to identify the conclusion. And actually the first answer it gives is kind of interesting. Cindy's conclusion in the passage is that their vacation will not be ruined because she believes the car won't break down on the way to Florida. It actually makes a common mistake here I see with students' answers as well. So before I investigate that further, I ask what the premises are, and it lists the premises correctly. And then I said, can you write the conclusion without including any premises? And then it says, Cindy's conclusion is that their vacation will not be ruined. And notice that it gets the pronouns right. It can switch from our vacation to their vacation. That may not be amazing to you, but I didn't think computers would be able to do that, and now they can. So, in any case, one common mistake I see on these kinds of problems is that people include the include the premises in the conclusion, and that's a mistake. And when prompted, it was able to correct that mistake. One thing that you should know is that if you find yourself using an indicator word like because in the statement of your conclusion, you know you haven't completely isolated the conclusion. There's still reasoning going on in the passage. So then I move things around. Right? Oops. Stop it. Okay. Oh, yeah. So it was able to identify the conclusion indicator. The screen is jumping. That was for a later problem. In any case, let's just look at where is it? Oh. Well, I gave it different versions of the problem. It's not showing up here, but you can take my word for it. No matter where I moved the conclusion in the passage, it was able to track that conclusion. Okay, I'm just going to show you how ChatGPT did with the last set of problems. So this is the one where you have to identify whether something is an argument or not, and then if it was an argument, put it in standard form. So the first one was just from the newspaper, and ChatGPT recognizes that it's not an argument. It says this is not an argument, it's a collection of statements reporting facts and statistics. And then at the end, the statements do not provide reasons or evidence for a particular claim, so it's not an argument. It gives a correct answer. ChatGPT talks like this, right? It's extra wordy and kind of clear, like it definitely doesn't want to be misunderstood. So you can kind of recognize its output, but in any case, it got that one right. Also, it recognized that 2 and 4 were arguments. And 4 was one I said sometimes throws people off because it doesn't have any indicator words in it, but it was fine with that. And actually doesn't look like I plugged in question 5, but you get the idea. ChatGPT can't answer these questions. I'm going to repeat my standard exhortation not to let machines do your thinking for you. But I find this interesting, and maybe at some point during the semester we'll have a chance to talk about what it means. Okay, so those are the homework answers. I just want to introduce a couple more pieces of vocabulary, one of which was not in the reading, but will be important for us going forward, so you should know it. It's on the review sheet. You should use that review sheet to study for the test. You can keep notes on it. So, in any case, one of the ways I've been distinguishing the traditions in studying critical thinking is by what they think the real problem is, or the big problem. And so for the tradition we're looking at now, the issue is fallacies. So a fallacy is an argument that appears to be good. In parentheses here, I have valid or strong, sound or cogent. Those are terms that we use to evaluate argument. They have technical meanings. We'll talk about them in the argument unit. In any case, a fallacy is an argument that appears to be good but is not. It's a common mistake in reasoning. So here's a simple example. Hasty generalization. A fallacy that is committed when one moves too quickly from a premise about a few individuals to a conclusion about a large group. And so that's an easy thing. You can see how people make that mistake all the time, and you can see why it's a fallacy. You can see why it's a mistake in reasoning. So that should be pretty straightforward. Okay, one item that I did not include in the textbook, I'm just introducing now because I think it's going to be useful, especially when we get to the social epistemology section, but also in the cognitive bias section. This is the idea of a web of belief. This metaphor was made famous by the philosopher W.V.O. Quine. But the idea here is that we can think of our beliefs as forming a web, kind of like a spider web, right? And the connections between those beliefs are like inferences, right? But the way our belief systems work, the change to any one belief will wind up reverberating across the whole web, especially if we're trying to be logically consistent, right? It will the change in belief will kind of travel through those threads of inference. But what's really important about this metaphor is that the idea that some beliefs are deeply held, and that means that they're more toward the center of the web, whereas other beliefs that are more easily changed are on the outside of the web. And so beliefs on the inside, if you change them, it would have more reverberations around the rest of your web of belief. So you don't want, so you're really reluctant to change those. And it's really only beliefs on the outside of your web that you're likely to change. And beliefs about ourselves and our identity tend to be in the deeply held belief category. Okay, so that's it. Next time we're going to get our preview of the cognitive bias literature. I've got 2 readings. They're pretty short. One's just an online explainer of popular reading. There's an exercise that asks you to apply concepts from those readings, and there's a video.